Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something about the idea of a library that feels safe, quiet, warm, the smell of old paper, the weight of a book in your hands, the slow, unhurried sense that knowledge is simply there, waiting for you to come and take it. Libraries in their very nature feel welcoming, open, human. There is something almost ritual about the act of walking into a library, the way your footsteps slow when you pass through those doors, the way your voice drops instinctively to a whisper, even when nobody has asked you to be quiet, the way the rows of shelves invite you to wander, to pull something down at random, to discover on a Tuesday afternoon a subject you had never considered thinking about. The silence in a good library is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of accumulation, or of all those words waiting patiently for someone to need them. But in the 41st millennium, some libraries were never meant to be opened. Some collections of knowledge are not merely dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, something you could hurt yourself with if you were careless. These places are dangerous in the way a sun is dangerous, or the vacuum of space, or the cold depths of the ocean, not because of any single sharp edge, but because the very act of knowing what is inside them changes you, because the information itself is a door, and once that door opens in your mind, there is no closing it again, no matter how desperately you wish you could forget, no matter how many years you spend praying that the things you read were lies. They were not lies, and now they live in you, and they will never leave. I consider what it would mean to truly, accurately understand the nature of a chaos god. Not the sanitized version passed down through the ministorum, the simple moral lesson about pride or anger or corruption. The actual mechanics, the actual architecture of what these entities are, how they formed, what they feed on, how they perceive time and causality, how they reach through the veil between the warp and the material universe. What would that level of knowledge do to the mind that held it? Not because the knowledge is poisonous in a simple, direct sense, but because the things being understood are entities that have existed for longer than human civilization. Entities that are woven from the stuff of mortal consciousness itself, built from the accumulated weight of every human desire, every fear, every act of violence and hope and despair that has echoed through the warp since the first human mind, that was psychically sensitive enough to leave a mark in that endless ocean of possibility. If you genuinely understand those entities, you understand yourself in them, because they are, in part, made of what we are. And that understanding is not safe. That understanding creates a resonance, a vibration, a frequency that those entities can, faintly but truly, sense and respond to. In the Imperium of man, in the Aeldari webway, in the sealed vaults beneath the moon of Titan, in the lightless sublevels of Mars, there are libraries, there are archives, there are repositories of collected lore that contain, if you could ever survive long enough to read them, as the complete and exhaustive record of everything that this galaxy has ever learned about the things that want to destroy it, about the nature of chaos, about the names and shapes and desires of entities so ancient and so alien that merely glimpsing a fragment of their true form is enough to break a mortal mind apart like a dry leaf. About the technologies that preceded the current age by tens of thousands of years, and the unspeakable things that those technologies could do when placed in the wrong hands. About the nature of the alien races that have walked this galaxy since before humanity ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. These libraries are not open to the public. They are not open to most soldiers, most leaders, or most scholars. And they are not even open to most of the individuals who have dedicated their entire lives to fighting the things those libraries contain information about. Entry is rare. Entry is guarded with more care and more ferocity than any fortress in the material world. And the reasons for that exclusion are not simply political, not simply a matter of classified information or power hoarding. The reasons go much deeper than that. Today, we are going to talk about those reasons. We are going to walk carefully through the most forbidden vaults of knowledge in the 41st millennium, and we are going to try to understand why the beings who guard them look at the thought of letting someone inside with something close to terror. We will talk about the Black Library of Chaos. The jewel of the Eldari's ancient wisdom is hidden at the heart of the webway, where no sun shines and no star can find it. We will talk about the sanctum sanctorum of the Grey Knights on the moon of Titan, where tens of thousands of tomes describe in intimate detail every demon the chapter has ever faced. We will talk about the Inquisition's dismal texts, about the vaults of Moravec beneath Olympus Mons on Mars, about the sealed archives inside every Deathwatch watch fortress, where even the most seasoned alien hunters dare not linger. And through all of it, we will keep coming back to one central question: not just why nobody enters these places, but why, in a universe full of terrible things, these particular places, these repositories of knowledge, are considered among the most dangerous locations in existence. The answer, when you sit with it long enough, is both simple and terrifying. Knowledge in the 41st millennium is not passive. It does not simply sit inside your head and wait to be useful. Some knowledge reaches back. Some knowledge knows it is being held. And some knowledge wants to be let out. Before we can talk about any specific library, we need to understand something fundamental about the world of Warhammer 40,000. Something that shapes everything about why information is treated the way it is in this universe. The 41st millennium is a world defined by scarcity of truth. The Imperium of man spans 1 million worlds and encompasses hundreds of billions of human souls. And the vast majority of those souls know almost nothing about the reality of the universe they inhabit. They know about the God Emperor on the Golden Throne, of course. What they know, that there are enemies of humanity out there in the dark. But the specific nature of those enemies, the mechanisms by which they function, the history of how they came to be and what they actually want, all of that is hidden from ordinary people. Deliberately, carefully, completely hidden. This is not merely authoritarian paranoia, though it is also that. The concealment of dangerous knowledge in the 41st millennium is a survival mechanism of the First Order. Because in a universe where there exists a dimension of pure psychic energy called the warp, a place where thought and emotion and desire take on physical form, the simple act of thinking about something is not as harmless as it sounds. The warp is connected to the minds of every psychically sensitive creature in the material universe. And the beings that live in the warp, the demons and entities and forces that drift through that endless psychic ocean, they listen for minds that are paying attention to them. They wait for the moment when a mortal creature begins to truly understand what they are. Because that understanding creates a connection. And a connection is a door. To understand this properly, you need to understand what the warp actually is. It is not merely a travel dimension or a magical energy source, though it serves both those functions. The warp is the psychic mirror of the material universe. Every emotion, every thought, every desire and fear and dream that any sentient being in the galaxy has ever experienced leaves a mark in the warp. These marks accumulate, interact, intensify, and eventually coalesce into patterns. And the largest, oldest, as most powerful of those patterns have developed something like consciousness, something like will. The Chaos Gods are not gods in the sense of supernatural creators. They are the concentrated, self-aware manifestation of mortal emotion, operating at a scale that exceeds anything individual beings can easily contemplate. Horn, the blood god, is the sum total of every act of violence, every moment of rage, every warrior who has ever found a dark satisfaction in the moment of killing. Nurgle, the plague father, is the strange comfort that human minds have always found in despair and decay, the way that sufferers sometimes find peace in surrendering to their illness. Slayanesh, the Dark Prince, is the endless spiral of sensation-seeking that lies at the edge of every pleasure, that part of every mind that wants more, that is never quite satisfied, that keeps pushing further. Tsench, the changer of the ways, is the universe's appetite for complexity, the way that plans breed counterplans, that change generates change. That hope and ambition and scheming create an ever-expanding web of possibility and manipulation. These entities are not outside of us. They are made of us. They are the amplified echo of what we are. And that means that any mind that begins to understand them with genuine accuracy is, in a very real sense, understanding something about itself. And that recognition, that moment of honest self-reflection that is built into the act of accurately comprehending what these entities are, creates a resonance, a vibration, a thread of connection between the mind doing the understanding and the entity being understood. This is why ignorance, it's in the 41st millennium, is sometimes not merely acceptable, but desirable. The farmers of 1,000 agri-worlds who know nothing about the nature of demons, except that they are enemies to be fled from, are safer than the scholars who understand precisely what those demons are and why they exist. The safety is not in the power of the knowledge. The safety is in the absence of the connection. This is also why the Inquisition exists, in significant part, to manage this problem, to find the people who know too much, and to either kill them or contain them, or, in very rare cases, put that knowledge to use in fighting the things it describes. So when we talk about forbidden libraries, we are not talking about places where inconvenient truths are hidden for political reasons, and the way governments in our own world might hide embarrassing documents or suppress uncomfortable histories. We are talking about something altogether more immediate. We are talking about places where the information itself is alive in a certain sense, where the collected weight of knowledge about the darkest things in the universe has created a kind of psychic resonance, a gravity well of dangerous awareness, and where any mind that enters that gravity well without sufficient preparation will be pulled apart by it. That is the backdrop against which every forbidden library in the 41st millennium exists. It is why the guards at these places are not merely soldiers. It is why the restrictions on entry are not merely bureaucratic. And it is why, so when someone does manage to get inside one of these places and walk among those shelves and read what is written there, they come out changed in ways that can never fully be undone. There is another layer to this that is worth sitting with before we move on. In the 41st millennium, knowledge does not simply accumulate value the way it does in quieter, safer universes. It accumulates weight. An archive of demon lore is not just a collection of facts. It is a concentrated field of psychic resonance, maintained and deepened by every new addition, by every new scholar who has understood something and added their understanding to the pile. The more complete an archive of dangerous knowledge becomes, the more powerful the resonance around it becomes, the more powerfully it attracts the attention of the things it describes, thus the more carefully it needs to be guarded. This is the paradox at the heart of every forbidden library in the 41st millennium. They exist because the knowledge they contain is necessary for fighting the darkness. They are dangerous because gathering that knowledge in one place makes the place itself a target. And the only way to resolve that paradox is to make the protection absolute, to ensure that the barrier between the archive and the things it describes is maintained with such consistency and such force that even the most powerful entities in the warp cannot bridge it. Most of the time, that works. Most of the time, the libraries hold. Most of the time. Now, let us start at the beginning, or rather, let us start at a place that has no beginning, because it has been moving through the webway for longer than the Imperium of man has existed. Let us start with the Black Library. Somewhere in the webway, there is a craft world that does not appear on any map. It moves through those endless psychic tunnels with no fixed course, following paths that are known only to the beings who guard it, shifting and sliding through the space between spaces with the quiet, inexorable patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time. Its exterior is black, not the flat black of painted metal or the dark of a starless void, but the deep, light-drinking black of something that has been scorched by fire that no longer burns, crystalline and ancient, and somehow still catching light that should not be there. still gleaming faintly with the memory of what it once was. Yet this is the Black Library of Chaos. To call it a library is in some sense an understatement. It is a full craft world, an enormous construct with all the complex architecture that the word implies. There are citadels inside it, and obelisks, and monoliths, and spires. There are passages that twist and double back on themselves in ways that seem designed to disorient. There are great bubble vaults hanging from the superstructure, sealed chambers suspended in stasis where the most dangerous of the artifacts within are held in a kind of suspended time, neither aging nor changing, nor affecting anything around them as long as the seals hold. The psychic emanations of the webway permeate the entire structure, and those emanations have a quality that is difficult to explain in practical terms. They regenerate, they restore. As a human who spent enough time within those walls would find their body healing itself, their aging processes slowing, the accumulated damage of decades gradually being undone. The Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevac, who we will speak of at length later, came out of his time within the Black Library looking decades younger than when he entered. The webway was giving him back his youth, or some portion of it. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you something important about what the Black Library is. It is not merely a vault where dangerous things are locked away. It is a living place. The craft world itself is psychically aware, the way all craft worlds are aware. Their infinity circuits weaving the spirits of the dead Aeldari into a collective consciousness that persists in the wraithbone of the structure. The Black Library thinks, it perceives, and it chooses. The knowledge that fills its shelves describes, with a comprehensiveness that no other collection in the galaxy can match, everything the Eldari have ever learned about chaos. This was not merely an academic exercise. The Eldari were, before the cataclysm of their fall, the most psychically gifted species in the galaxy. Their civilization was 10,000 years old, when humanity was still learning to farm. They explored the warp in ways that no human has ever approached. They studied its currents and its inhabitants. They catalogued the natures of the entities that dwelt within it. They developed sorcery of extraordinary sophistication, and that sorcery was grounded in a genuine and exhaustive understanding of how the warp worked. And then their civilization destroyed itself. What the fall of the Aeldari is one of the most significant events in the entire history of the galaxy. In an act of collective spiritual catastrophe that does not have any clean analogy in human experience, the psychic excess of Aeldari civilization literally tore a new chaos god into existence. Slaanesh, the prince of excess, she who thirsts, was born from the resonance of billions of Eldari minds, consumed by pleasure and hedonism, and the constant addictive drive towards sensation. The birth of Slaanesh killed the majority of the Eldari species in an instant. It consumed their gods, devoured their souls, shattered their empire. The ones who survived did so through a combination of luck, distance, and spiritual preparation. The craft world Eldari had been moving their civilization onto giant wandering ships before the fall struck. The Exodites had already fled to primitive worlds far from the corruption. The Harlequins, servants of Kegarach the Laughing God, survived because their patron deity had kept himself apart from the degeneration, his essential trickster nature protecting him from the excess that consumed the others. And somewhere in all of that catastrophe, the Black Library survived. The knowledge the Eldari had gathered about chaos, every tome and scroll and data crystal describing the powers and weaknesses and true natures of the warp's inhabitants, was preserved within its moving halls, kept safe behind a psychic barrier, powerful enough to exclude virtually anything that was not specifically and deliberately invited in. The reason the Black Library still exists, 10,000 years after the fall, is not just that the Eldari value knowledge, as though they do. It is that the knowledge inside those walls is, in the most direct possible sense, a weapon. The complete Aeldari understanding of chaos, accumulated over thousands of years of study and suffering and bitter experience, is one of the only things in the galaxy that could, theoretically, give a sufficiently prepared being the information they would need to fight chaos and survive, to know its weaknesses, to understand its patterns, to recognize the ways it manipulates and corrupts and seduces, to see through its lies. That is what the Black Library contains. A complete manual for fighting the apocalypse, written in the language of beings who spent thousands of years studying the apocalypse before they accidentally helped cause part of it. And if you understand that, you begin to understand why nobody is allowed in. Yes, the physical structure of the Black Library's defenses is staggering, but the most important defense is not physical at all. The Black Library's collective psychic consciousness does something remarkable when any being approaches its gates. It reads them, not in the crude, invasive way that a psyker might scan someone's surface thoughts, but in a deep and thorough way that reaches down through the layers of conscious intent and unconscious desire into the fundamental structure of the mind itself. It is looking for something specific, the presence or absence of what might be called spiritual weakness. The knowledge inside the Black Library is, to put it plainly, exactly what Chaos most wants. The complete Eldari record of every technique, every name, every true form, every weakness and strength of the beings in the warp. If a Chaos entity, or a being corrupted by Chaos, or even just a being who had not yet confronted and come to terms with the darkness within themselves, managed to read those tomes, they would not gain the knowledge of how to fight Chaos. They would gain the knowledge of how to serve it better. The temptations embedded in that information are not incidental. They are intrinsic. The descriptions of what Chaos can offer are necessarily accurate if they are to be of any use. And a mind that has not developed sufficient resistance to those offers, a mind that still secretly wants what Chaos promises, even a little, even unconsciously, would not be studying those texts for long before it began to wonder. So the Black Library refuses entry to the spiritually immature. This is not a metaphor. The barrier around the library is maintained by the psychic resonance of the Infinity Circuit and the accumulated will of the Black Council literally does not allow minds in a certain state of development to cross its threshold. Those who have not confronted and metabolized the chaos within themselves, which is another way of saying those who still harbor vulnerabilities of desire and fear and grief and ambition that chaos could exploit, find that they simply cannot enter. The gateway does not open for them. The passages refuse to lead them inward. The library itself rejects them with a passive certainty that requires no guard, no weapon, no spoken refusal. This is why the two groups that can come and go freely within the Black Library are so interesting to think about. The first group is the Eldari Solitaires, as the Solitaires are the rarest and most spiritually extreme members of the Harlequin troops. To become a Solitaire, an Eldari must essentially surrender their soul to the laughing god Segurach. They walk alone, outside even the social structures of the Harlequins. They portray the role of Slaanesh in the great theatrical performances of Harlequin history, and in doing so, they confront face to face, within their own minds and bodies, the absolute darkest aspects of the Eldari experience. They embody the thing that destroyed their civilization. They carry the memory of destruction in every performance, and in doing so, they have done something remarkable. They have so thoroughly mastered the presence of chaos within themselves, have faced it so completely and so honestly that there is nothing left for chaos to get purchase on. But there is no hidden weakness, no secret temptation, no unexamined corner of desire or ambition where a demon could find a foothold. They are the only beings in existence who have, quite literally, made themselves chaos-proof. And so the Black Library lets them walk straight in. The second group is the Illuminati. The Illuminati are humans, specifically humans who have survived possession by a demon, and then, through a process that should be impossible, expelled that demon not just from their bodies, but from any claim on their souls. These individuals are described in certain fragments of inquisitorial lore as having essentially completed a full cycle of corruption and redemption. They were taken by chaos, and they came back. And in coming back, they brought with them an understanding of what they had survived that is impossible to acquire any other way. You cannot study your way into the knowledge a survivor possesses. You cannot train for it. You can only live it and survive it, and those who do emerge in a state of genuine invulnerability to the specific temptations they have already overcome. The Illuminati are, in the mythology of the 41st millennium, part of a secret cadre working toward the eventual resurrection of the Emperor, in a form capable of truly leading humanity again. Whether that goal has any realistic chance of being achieved is a subject of extensive debate in certain very classified circles. But the Black Library's willingness to accept them as free guests speaks volumes about how the Eldari view them. They are, in the library's estimation, the closest thing humanity has produced to beings who can handle the truth. Everyone else who has ever gained entry to the Black Library did so by proving themselves to the satisfaction of the Black Council, the governing body of the wisest farseers drawn from across all craft worlds. And even that entry was strictly controlled, strictly supervised, and strictly limited in scope. The interior itself, for those few who have penetrated its gates, is described in fragments of Imperial and Eldari lore as an intentional labyrinth. Not accidental, not merely complex, but deliberately designed to disorient and confound. The passages twist. The architecture violates the logic you would expect. You can enter a room and find yourself uncertain of which direction you came from. This is, again, not incidental, as the library does not want people wandering unsupervised through its contents. The maze is another layer of defense, a way of ensuring that even someone who physically made it past the gates would still need guidance from someone who knew the paths before they could find anything. The contents themselves, arranged across citadels and spires and those great bubble vaults, are described only in the most fragmentary terms by the handful of people who have ever seen them. Tomes, scrolls, data crystals, books that glow with their own light, and others that seem to absorb the light around them. Texts in scripts that no living being currently knows how to read. Artifacts sealed in stasis, held just outside the normal flow of time, so that whatever they are cannot spread or grow or affect the material world. The Wraith Tower, where one specific section of the library is said to be dedicated entirely to the accumulated record of humanity's interactions with chaos. The Imperial records, the histories of the traitor legions, everything the humans have learned about the ruinous powers, including things that Imperial archives have officially declared never happened. All of it is here, preserved, catalogued, and in the very center of everything, on an obsidian plinth, there rests a crystal tome bound with chains of light. The chains were once more numerous than they are now. They have been fading one by one as certain events come to pass. The lore says that this tome contains the written words of the laughing god himself, words that describe not the inevitable victory of chaos in the final battle of the Eldari, the Rana Dandra, but the great jest at the end of time. Oshegarak's final act of trickery that would see Slanesh spend all her power saving the Eldari rather than consuming them. The ultimate reversal, the punchline that only a god could survive telling. Whether such a thing is possible, whether Tegarak truly walks in the margins of the galaxy playing his long games, is not for any mortal being to know with certainty. But the fact that the Eldari keep this tome at the very heart of their most secret place, that they guard it with the full weight of their ancient civilization's survival, tells you something profound about their relationship to hope. Even the Eldari, the species that has stared into the abyss of their own near extinction and felt that abyss staring back, still have something that functions like hope. They just keep it somewhere nobody can reach. There is a name that comes up repeatedly whenever the history of the Black Library is discussed, a name that has been attached to the library's closed doors for nearly 10,000 years, searching for a way in with the obsessive patience of someone who has always believed that the answer is on the other side. That name is Ahriman. To understand what Ahriman represents in the context of the Black Library, you need to understand what he is. He is the chief librarian of the Thousand Suns Traitor Legion, a Chaos Space Marine who has been alive and active for 10,000 years, since the era of the Horus heresy. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most powerful sorcerers in the galaxy. He is a student of Tzinchor, the chaos god of change and sorcery and manipulation, and he is, unlike most of Chaos's servants, something that is genuinely difficult to categorize morally. Ahriman did not fall to Chaos because he wanted power or glory or revenge. He fell to Chaos because he tried to save his brothers. The Thousand Sons, the Space Marine Legion of the Primarch Magnus the Red, were psychers almost to a man. Their psychic gifts were immense. And in the aftermath of the Horus heresy, that psychic potential became a curse. The Legion began to suffer what was called the flesh change, mutations driven by their uncontrolled warp sensitivity, mutations that threatened to dissolve them entirely. Ahriman, in desperation, developed a ritual of extraordinary ambition. He called it the Rubric. He intended it to purify the Legion, to lock away the mutations, to stabilize his brothers in their corrupted state and preserve them. The Rubric worked, after a fashion, but the Marines who were already mutated beyond recovery had their souls fused permanently into their suits of power armor, becoming the Rubric Marines, animated armor with a ghost inside and no independent will left. The sorcerers strong enough to survive were preserved, their psychic powers actually enhanced. And the flesh change was stopped. But the cost was catastrophic, and Ahriman's Primarch Magnus the Red was furious with him. Magnus banished Ahriman from the Legion, and so Ahriman became what he remains, a wanderer, an exile, a sorcerer of immense power with a goal that he has been pursuing for 10,000 years and has not yet achieved. He wants to enter the Black Library. The specific desire is textured and complicated. Ahriman serves Tzinch, but his relationship with that service is not simple devotion. Tzinch is the changer of the ways, the great conspirator, the being whose essential nature is flux and change, and the eternal manipulation of outcomes. Tzinch is, in a certain sense, unknowable, even to his own servants. His plans are plans within plans within plans, and no single thread of any of those plans can ever be fully seen from the inside. Ahriman, a being of enormous intelligence and psychic insight who has spent 10,000 years wrestling with the implications of serving an inherently unknowable master, reached a point where he decided that the only way to truly understand what he was dealing with was to find the most comprehensive record of Chaos's nature that existed, which brought him, inevitably, to the Black Library. The sheer scale of the effort Ahriman has put into this quest deserves its own contemplation. For nearly 10,000 years, he has been probing the Black Library's defenses, studying the webway, searching for maps, for keys, for weaknesses in the barrier. He has raided archives across the galaxy looking for fragments of information about the library's location and access protocols. He consumed the contents of an entire repository of knowledge called the Athenaeum of Callimachus, absorbing thousands of years of accumulated scholarship in a single act of psychic consumption. He has waged wars, not because the wars were the point, but because the wars were research. Every enemy he fought, every secret he uncovered, was another data point in a 10,000-year calculation aimed at opening one specific door. In 998 of the 41st millennium, the millennium before our current era of Indomitus, Ahriman came closer than ever before. He led his warband, the Prodigal Sons, directly into the webway. Not a subtle infiltration, a full assault, engaging Harlequin troops in furious combat within those ancient tunnels, crashing through the defences that the craftworlds of Ulthway and Lugganath had spent years maintaining. The fighting was described, in the fragments that made it into any record at all, as some of the most intense and personal combat the webway had ever seen. Harlequins against Rubric Marines in the narrow passages of the labyrinth dimension, colours and fire, and the bright lethal dance of beings who fight not just to win, but to prove something. Ahriman advanced to within sight of the Black Library itself. He could see it. He was that close. He was still stopped. The Harlequins drove him back with enormous cost to themselves. What the section of webway that his assault had passed through was so damaged, so thoroughly churned up by the combat that erupted within it, that the Eldari lost that passage permanently. To this day, that particular arterial path through the labyrinth dimension is described as choked with the dead, a portion of the galaxy's oldest transit network essentially sacrificed to ensure that one sorcerer did not reach one door. That tells you something about how seriously the Eldari take what is inside that library. They permanently surrendered a portion of their most precious infrastructure to keep Ahriman out. They paid in irreplaceable coin, and they still consider it a price worth paying. The reason Ahriman cannot get in, despite his power and his preparation, is the same reason the library refuses everyone who is not specifically invited. But he is not, in the library's estimation, sufficiently free of the corruption within himself. 10,000 years of service to Tzeentch, however reluctant or complicated that service has been, have left marks. Not the gross corruption of a mindless chaos worshipper, but the subtle marks of a being who has accepted, at a fundamental level, the warp's influence on his psyche, who has allowed his quest, however noble its original motivation, to become something Tzeentch can use. The library sees that, and the library keeps the door closed. There is something darkly poetic about this. Ahriman's entire existence is a study in the consequences of reaching for knowledge that exceeds one's ability to safely contain it. His original crime was casting the rubric, a spell of such ambition that it required him to channel forces he did not fully understand. The result was disaster, even though the spell succeeded, and now he spends his eternal life trying to enter the place that contains the understanding he lacked. He is, in a very real sense, trapped in the lesson he has not yet been able to learn. But Ahriman's obsession with the Black Library is not simply personal. It represents something larger about the nature of forbidden knowledge and who seeks it. Consider the other beings in the 41st millennium who have also desired entry and been refused. Demon princes of Tzeentch, beings of enormous psychic power who have served the Changer of the Ways for millennia, have made their own attempts to penetrate the webway and find the library. They have all failed for the same fundamental reason. But the barrier evaluates not just spiritual maturity but spiritual orientation. A being that has already given itself to the warp is not a being that can wield knowledge of the warp without adding to its power. There is no version of a corrupted mind studying accurate chaos law where that study leads anywhere good. The reading changes, but the corruption channels the change. This is why the most persistent and sophisticated attempts on the Black Library have all come from beings who occupy that strange middle ground. Not full chaos servants, not uncorrupted mortals, but beings who have been marked by the warp without being entirely consumed by it. Ahriman is the most famous, but he is not alone. There have been rogue inquisitors who spent decades navigating the edges of the webway, trying to find a path to the library without being invited. There have been Eldar corsairs, technically outside the Craftworld hierarchy, who pursued the library's location through channels their Craftworld brethren would never have approved. There have been human scholars with just enough psychic sensitivity to detect the library's presence somewhere in the labyrinth, who spent their lives trying to close the distance between sensing and arriving. All of them failed, not through lack of effort or intelligence, but because the Black Library is not, at its core, a place you can find. It is a place that finds you, and it only finds beings it has already decided are worth the risk. The deeper question that Ahriman's story raises is this: what would happen if he actually got in? The answer, if the Black Library's own philosophy is correct, is that access would not go as Ahriman intends. If the library has judged him unready, if he were somehow to bypass that judgment through brute force, through the destruction of sufficient webway architecture to tear a path through, regardless of the psychic barrier's assessment, he would arrive in a place designed to contain and direct minds far less capable than his, and those minds would be at risk. Ahriman's mind, sharp and enormous as it is also threaded through with 10,000 years of Tzeentch's influence. His curiosity.
Okay, real talk for a second, and I mean this genuinely. The more I researched this topic, the more I kept thinking about how 40k lore does something that most science fiction doesn't. It makes knowledge itself the scary thing. Not the monsters, not the armies, the knowing. That hit different for me because in most stories, understanding your enemy is just good. That's how you win. But in this universe, understanding your enemy is also how you become them. A little bit. The Black Library gets that. The Grey Knights get that. And honestly, I think that's one of the reasons this lore sticks with people the way it does. But anyways, that's just where my head went while writing this one, so let's keep going.
And his ambition have been shaped by a deity whose fundamental nature is to create webs of manipulation that nobody else can fully see. In the Black Library, with its concentrated records of chaos's nature, that shaping would not become less active, it would become more. Every text he read would filter through the lens of a consciousness that has been was patiently worked on by the great conspirator for 100 centuries. He would not learn what chaos is. He would learn what Tzeentch wants him to think chaos is. And the difference between those two things might be the most dangerous gap in the galaxy. Tzeentch, presumably, finds this endlessly amusing. There are two human beings in the entire history of the 41st millennium who actually entered the Black Library through something approaching legitimate means. The first is an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos named Bronislaw Chevac, and his story is one of the most remarkable in all of the Inquisition's recorded history, which is saying a great deal given how extensive and strange that history is. Chevac was an unusual inquisitor from the beginning. His particular obsession was the Eldari, their history, their culture, their relationship to chaos, their methods of fighting it. He studied them with a dedication that his fellow inquisitors found unsettling at best and heretical at worst. More than once, he was brought before inquisitorial conclaves and warned, in terms that ranged from stern to openly threatening, that his studies were dangerously close to compromising his loyalty to the human species. He persisted anyway. He was not interested in the Eldari because he admired them, exactly. He was interested because they had been fighting chaos for longer than humanity had existed, and they had learned things about how to survive that fight which no human had yet discovered. Eventually, his years of scholarship and his proven dedication to fighting chaos on every front he could reach drew the attention of the Black Council. As the Eldari Farseers watched him from a distance, the way they watch most things that interest them. They studied his mind in the ways that only beings of their psychic sensitivity can. And they came to a decision that was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. They invited him in. Chevac entered the Black Library as a guest of the Black Council. He was given access, under supervision, to the section called the Wraith Tower, dedicated to humanity's relationship with chaos. He spent years studying within those walls, reading through records that the Imperium had officially declared destroyed or non-existent. He read the accumulated Eldari scholarship on human corruption, on the traitor legions, on the ways that chaos had worked its influence into imperial institutions that still existed and were still considered loyal. Had he read things that should have broken him, and they did change him? How could they not? But they did not corrupt him. When Chevac eventually left the Black Library, he looked decades younger than when he had entered. The psychic regeneration of the webway had been at work on his body during all those years of scholarship. He walked out into the Imperium carrying in his head one of the most complete and accurate understandings of chaos that any human had ever possessed. He also walked out with something he had stolen, the Atlas Infernal, a living map of the webway, itself an artifact of extraordinary value, made with pages of impossibly thin crystal and bound in a cover that could deflect bolter fire. Its origins are unclear even now. Chevac's theory was that it was originally human, or made by the Emperor or under the Emperor's direction during the Great Crusade, and that the Eldari had acquired it at some point in the intervening millennia. Chevac argued that this meant he had simply recovered an imperial artifact. The Black Council presumably had a different perspective on this. because Chevac spent the years after his departure from the library being hunted by harlequins, by chaos sorcerers who wanted the Atlas for themselves, and by inquisitorial factions who considered his time inside the library sufficient grounds for declaring him dangerously compromised. He outwitted all of them. For decades, armed with a stolen map of the webway and a mind full of Eldari chaos lore, Chevac became one of the most effective anti-chaos operatives in the galaxy. His biggest persistent problem was Ahriman, who recognized in Chevac's possession of the Atlas Infernal the closest thing to a map to the Black Library that had ever been held by someone outside the Eldari hierarchy. The two of them played a cat-and-mouse game across the galaxy for years, the arch-sorcerer of the Thousand Suns hunting an old man who kept staying exactly one step ahead. The second human to enter the Black Library did so less as a guest and more as a determined trespasser. His name was Jack Draco, an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, a man whose story is so baroque and strange that it reads, in the fragmentary accounts that survive, more like a fever dream than a historical record. Draco followed the Emperor's Tarot, the peculiar divination system used by certain inquisitors, and found in its readings a path into the Black Library that no one else had identified. As he entered, he stole something of enormous significance, a text called the Book of the Rana Dandra, which is also known as the Eldari Book of Fate, the document describing the prophesied final battle of the Eldari, the Rana Dandra, and everything the Eldari believed they knew about how the end of their civilization would unfold. Draco took this book not because he wanted power, but because he was, by that point in his career, a man thoroughly consumed by the question of what the Emperor actually intended for humanity. He believed the answer might be connected to the Eldari's foreknowledge of galactic endings. He was probably right. Whether that justifies the theft is a question without a clean answer. What both Chevac and Draco demonstrate, each in their own way, is something important about the Black Library's attitude toward knowledge and those who seek it. The library is not simply a vault that keeps things locked away. It is a system that evaluates the beings who approach it and tries to make judgments about whether their access to its contents will serve the cause of opposing chaos or serve the cause of strengthening it. Most of the time, those judgments result in a closed door. Occasionally, rarely, they result in something more. But even when the door opens, even when access is granted, the nature of what a person does with that access reveals whether the library's judgment was sound. Chevac's story has a quality of genuine tragedy running through it that becomes more apparent the longer you think about it. But he entered the Black Library as a man who had spent his career studying the Eldari out of a conviction that they knew things humanity needed to know. He spent years inside, reading through records that had never been accessed by a human before. He emerged younger, and in terms of pure information, vastly more informed than any human being alive about the nature of chaos and the Eldari's methods of fighting it. He left carrying both the knowledge in his head and the Atlas Infernal in his hands, and then he spent the rest of his life being hunted, not just by Ahriman, though Ahriman was the most persistent and most capable of his pursuers. The Black Council itself had, by the time Chevac left with the Atlas, decided that the risk he represented outweighed the value of his continued freedom. A human walking through the galaxy with a complete map of the webway and a head full of Eldari chaos lore is, from the Black Council's perspective, an extremely dangerous variable. He could be captured by chaos forces. The Atlas could be taken from him. His memories could be extracted by a sufficiently powerful sorcerer. Everything the library had given him could, through him, end up exactly where the library was built to prevent it from going. Chevac's defense against all of this was his own intelligence and preparation, the very qualities that had earned him entry in the first place. He used the Atlas to navigate the webway in ways that none of his pursuers could anticipate. He used the knowledge in his head to stay exactly one step ahead of the things that wanted to take it from him. As he survived for decades in a situation where most beings would have been dead within months, but survival had a cost. He could never stay anywhere long enough to put down roots. He could never trust institutions, because every institution he had once been part of had at least one faction that wanted to catch or kill him. He could never share what he had learned in any comprehensive way, because the dissemination of that knowledge to unprepared minds was exactly the outcome the library's contents were designed to prevent. He carried the most complete human understanding of chaos ever assembled, and he carried it largely alone, using it quietly in the fights he chose and the interventions he made, unable to give it to anyone who could use it as effectively as he could. As this is the most honest picture of what it actually means to have access to a forbidden library and to use that access responsibly, not glory, not power, not transformation into something greater, isolation, responsibility that can never be set down, and the permanent awareness that the knowledge you carry is both your greatest weapon and the thing that makes you, forever, a target. Draco's story is different in texture, but similar in conclusion. He trespassed, he stole. And the Book of the Rana Dandra that he took from the Black Library gave him what he wanted, in the sense that it contained the information he had been seeking. But the information itself could not do for him what he hoped. You cannot read your way to certainty about the Emperor's intentions. You cannot study your way to a plan that works across the scale and complexity of the 41st millennium. The book told him what the Eldari believed about how their civilization would end. It did not tell him what he actually needed to know, which was what a loyal servant of the Emperor should do with that information. Some knowledge, even when accurately acquired, does not translate into the clarity it seems to promise. This is, perhaps, the final lesson of the Forbidden Libraries. They contain the most important and most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy. But knowledge, even perfect knowledge, does not make decisions for you. It does not guarantee wisdom. It does not substitute for the harder, quieter, or its more personal work of knowing yourself well enough to use what you have learned in the service of something genuinely worth serving. The libraries can tell you everything about chaos. They cannot tell you who you are in relation to it. That part is yours. Far from the webway, in the cold shadow of Saturn's rings, there is a moon called Titan. And on Titan, carved from basalt in the ungentle style of people who have decided that beauty is a luxury they cannot afford, there is a fortress. The fortress belongs to the Grey Knights. If you have heard of the Grey Knights at all, you know the broad outlines. They are a space marine chapter. They are the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, meaning they are the soldiers assigned to the Inquisition's demon hunting division. Every single member of the chapter is a psyker, which is extremely unusual for the Adeptus Astartes. They were created in secret, drawn from space marines who had severed their ties to their original legions, guided by the direct influence of the Emperor himself in the final days before the heresy consumed everything. In over 10,000 years of service, not one Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos. Not one. In a universe where the very air sometimes carries the potential for corruption, where the greatest warriors in history have had their souls eaten by the warp, the Grey Knights stand as an unbroken line. The reasons for this are complex and fascinating, and not entirely comfortable, but they are real. The Grey Knights genuinely cannot be corrupted, or perhaps more accurately, have developed such extraordinary defenses against corruption that no attempt on them has succeeded in 10,000 years. And the reason for those defenses is, in part, the sanctum sanctorum. At the heart of the Grey Knights' fortress on Titan, behind triple-sealed portals bound with technologies that were ancient even during the Great Crusade, and warp magics layered over millennia of maintenance, there is a chamber that the Grey Knights call the sanctum sanctorum. It is their version of the Black Library. Their collected knowledge of everything they have encountered, everything they have defeated, everything they know about the nature of demons and the minds that command them. The sanctum is vast. The towering shelves of time-worn tomes, crumbling scrolls, and fragmented data crystals stretch far above the head of any visitor, was tended by Grey Knights librarians who have divided the archive between them, each specializing in a different section of the chapter's history or lore. Assisting these librarians are what the texts describe as queues of shuffling, hunchbacked servitors, their lobotomized brains wiped and reprogrammed at the start and end of each day. Not once, every single day. Their minds are cleared at dawn and rebuilt for the task ahead, and cleared again at dusk when their work is done. This is because these servitors are handling documents that contain information capable of reaching through a mind and using it as a doorway. Even a lobotomized brain, even a barely functioning cognitive architecture designed only for cataloging and retrieval, is considered too much of a risk if it retains anything it has learned across too long a period. But the day's memories are erased every day, but even the main body of the sanctum is not the most dangerous part. In the deepest corner of the sanctum sanctorum, encased in walls and floor and ceiling of adamantium meters thick, bound with esoteric wards and layers of void shielding, there is a single passage leading to a chamber. This chamber is the librarium demonica. The passage to the librarium demonica has 3 doors. The first is a hulking blast door, heavy enough to resist a sustained melter-fire barrage. The cipher lock on this door has an essentially infinite number of possible combinations. The second door is different. It involves a vortex, a spinning field of psychic energy built into the corridor itself. As any being even weakly connected to the warp who attempts to cross this vortex without speaking the precise words of power that neutralize it will have their soul ripped away from their body. Not damaged, not harmed, removed. The third door is guarded by a Grey Knight's librarian who kneels in meditative silence before it, resting on the pommel of his blade, and who will rise and attack without hesitation, without negotiation, without any exchange of pleasantries whatsoever, if the correct identifying words are not spoken the moment he becomes aware of a presence before him. The Grey Knight, standing this vigil, is told to trust nobody. The text describing this duty is explicit. The Guardian is to know that he must not trust the appearance of any being that comes before him, whether or not they wear the guise of a Grey Knight, but whether or not they bear the face of a dear brother. Demons can take the form of friends. Chaos can wear familiar faces. The only thing that matters is the words. And even then, the librarian's judgment about whether those words carry the right quality of psychic authenticity is the final check. Within the librarium demonica, in those age-worn oak cabinets, on those crumbling scrolls and tarnished data crystals, in the twisting corridors of what is described as a gloomy and forbidden place, there is something that the Grey Knights consider their most precious and most dangerous possession: the names of every demon they have ever encountered. Think about what that means. In the theology and practice of the Grey Knights, a demon's true name is a weapon of extraordinary power. As knowing the true name of a demon is not merely useful information, it provides leverage, a point of psychic contact, a vulnerability that can be exploited in combat against that specific entity. The Liber Demonicum, the small book that every Grey Knight carries in a ceramite case on his breastplate, contains exactly 666 words distilled from the knowledge of the Librarium Demonica. These are the essential tenets, the most broadly applicable fragments of the collected demon lore of the chapter. But the full Librarium contains far more than 666 words. The Librarium Demonica holds the product of 10,000 years of meticulous scholarship by the most demon-experienced warriors in the Imperium. Every creature they have faced, every entity they have banished back to the warp, every piece of information about the nature of each distinct demon, its relationship to its patron Chaos God, its specific vulnerabilities, the precise nature of its true name. All of it, gathered and preserved and kept in a place that is more heavily defended than most planetary fortresses. For this knowledge, ever to leave Titan would be a disaster of unimaginable proportions. This is not hyperbole in the text. This is the actual, stated assessment of the Grey Knights themselves, beings who are not given to dramatic understatement. If the enemies of the Grey Knights were even to learn of the Librarium's existence, it could spell doom for the chapter, not inconvenience, not setback, doom. Because the Librarium Demonica contains, in one place, a comprehensive record of every advantage the Grey Knights have over the demons they fight. Every name is a weapon in the hands of the Knights. Every name is a vulnerability in the hands of a demon who learns that it has been named. The complete text of the librarium, if it were somehow accessed by a force of chaos with the sophistication to use it properly, would give that force the ability to identify precisely how the Grey Knights fight each entity they encounter and to prepare countermeasures. More than that, it would give the Dark Gods knowledge of which of their servants had been studied, catalogued, and categorized by the most effective demon hunters in the galaxy. The Grey Knights protect the Librarium Demonica with their lives, because in a very practical sense, the Librarium Demonica is their most important tool for preserving those lives. But there is one additional feature of the Sanctum Sanctorum that deserves mention. In one corner of the complex, sealed away from the rest in its own stasis vault, a time-locked chamber from which there can be no escape once the door closes, there are small cubic devices that the text describes as tesseract labyrinths. Each one contains the captured essence of a daemon. Not a daemon's record, not a daemon's name. The daemon itself, trapped, suspended, unable to act or influence anything from within the perfect enclosure of its dimensional prison. These tesseract labyrinths are technologies of Necron origin. The Grey Knights acquired them through means that the chapter's records are, understandably, somewhat vague about. But their practical function is extraordinary, yet they are the ultimate expression of the Grey Knight's doctrine of turning an enemy's own nature against it. The chamber that holds them is supercharged, the accumulated psychic pressure of all those imprisoned entities pressing against the walls of their containers in a constant, building need to escape. Only the most seasoned and confident members of the chapter are even allowed to enter the room. The energy in that space is not comfortable. The whispering is apparently constant. It is worth pausing here to think about what the Grey Knights actually are in more depth, because understanding them makes the Sanctum Sanctorum's design more comprehensible. They are not merely powerful psychers in space marine frames. Their entire purpose, their entire architecture as human beings, as is built around the premise that you can understand the darkness and not become it. Every Grey Knight recruit is screened not just for psychic potential, but for a particular quality of character that is very difficult to articulate in simple terms. It is not goodness in any simple moral sense. The Grey Knights are not especially gentle or merciful. It is something more specific, a kind of self-awareness combined with will, the ability to know exactly what they carry within them, all the anger and fear and ambition that every mortal being contains, and to hold those things at arm's length without pretending they are not there. To say, yes, this is in me, and it will not move me. This is the same quality that the Black Library is looking for, to the same essential characteristic that separates those who can safely engage with forbidden knowledge from those who cannot. The Grey Knights have built an entire military culture around it. Every aspect of their training is aimed at developing and maintaining this quality. The long meditations, the careful rituals of purification before engaging with anything connected to the warp, the mental exercises designed to make every Grey Knight intimately familiar with the specific shape of their own vulnerabilities. The idea being that you cannot defend against something you have not honestly looked at. The Sanctum Sanctorum is, in this sense, not just a library. It is a testing ground. Every time a Grey Knight librarian is required to enter the Librarium Demonica and consult its contents, yet they are subjected to the most demanding version of the evaluation that defines their brotherhood. Can they walk into that room with its whispers and its accumulated weight of thousands of years of demon knowledge and walk back out again carrying only what they went in to find? Can they read the true name of a greater demon, understand it, absorb it into their tactical understanding, and emerge without having allowed any thread of that demon's nature to find purchase in their consciousness? Most of the time they can. They are very good at what they do, but the word most sits there, in any honest accounting of the Grey Knight's history, with a certain quiet weight. In 10,000 years of service, there have been individual Grey Knights who faltered, who went into the librarium and came back changed in ways that their brothers recognized and responded to with sorrow and with certainty. The chapter has never lost a member to chaos in the ultimate sense. But the difference between that ultimate failure and a quieter, more partial one is not as absolute as the official record might suggest. The Grey Knights do not talk about these things outside their own walls. Their secrecy is absolute. The Imperium as a whole does not know of the sanctum sanctorum's existence in any useful way. The vast majority of Space Marine chapters do not know the Grey Knights maintain a record of demon true names at all. This level of operational secrecy is not pride or institutional paranoia. It is rational defense. What if the enemies of the Grey Knights were ever to learn with certainty that the Librarium Demonica existed and what it contained? The tactical and strategic consequences would be severe. Suddenly, every demon the Grey Knights had ever catalogued would know it had been named. Suddenly, the Chaos Gods would know exactly what their enemies understood about their servants. The careful, painful work of 10,000 years of scholarship would become a liability instead of an asset, turned against its authors by the simple fact of its existence becoming known. And beyond the tactical considerations, there are the psychic ones. The sanctum sanctorum is protected by layers of warding that require constant maintenance, layers maintained by the chapter's librarians through regular ritual acts, or through the collective psychic discipline of the entire Brotherhood. If those wards were ever to be known and specifically targeted, the chaos forces capable of such an assault would know exactly what to aim for, not the physical walls. The psychic infrastructure that keeps the resonance of 10,000 years of demon knowledge from bleeding out into the material world and being felt by the things it describes. The sanctum sanctorum is, in the most direct possible sense, a place that exists in opposition to the things it contains knowledge about. Every day it exists. Every day those tomes sit in their oak cabinets, and those data crystals hold their information, and those Grey Knights librarians maintain their meditative vigils. It is a declaration, a statement that mortal minds can hold the darkest truths in the universe and not be broken by them. That preparation and will and honest self-knowledge are sufficient to look directly at the abyss and decline its invitation. It is the most expensive declaration in the history of the chapter. It costs them constantly, and they consider every cost paid in full. The Inquisition, as an institution, has its own complicated relationship with forbidden knowledge. This relationship is built into the fundamental structure of what the Inquisition does. To hunt demons, you need to know what demons are. To identify heresy, you need to know what heresy looks like from the inside. To track and eliminate cults devoted to the Chaos Gods, you need to understand what those cults believe and how those beliefs function. There is no version of this job description that does not require some familiarity with the things you are trying to destroy. The Inquisition manages this paradox through a body of knowledge called the dismal texts. The dismal texts are a classification of forbidden and heretical tomes that the Inquisition has accumulated over the millennia, deemed too dangerous to be destroyed, but too dangerous to be freely circulated. They come from everywhere. Some are works of alien civilizations that fell long before humanity reached the stars. Some speak of concepts so antithetical to the imperial creed that their mere existence is considered a form of violence against the order of society. Some were written down by agents of the Inquisition themselves. Scholars who encountered information so significant that they felt compelled to preserve it, even knowing that doing so put them in danger. And some, the most dangerous and most carefully guarded, describe in explicit and actionable detail how to summon demonic entities from the warp. To possess one of these latter texts is not merely to have information, it is to carry a beacon. The specific knowledge of how to summon a demon is not just a method, it is a psychic attractor, a set of resonances that, in a mind that understands what it describes, creates a kind of connection to the warp that a sufficiently attentive entity on the other side could potentially detect and respond to. The Inquisition's scholars have developed some limited techniques for shielding texts of this type from psychic radiation, but they are imperfect. As they degrade over time, the wards need maintenance, which means people need to approach the text to maintain them, which means more minds are being exposed to the content. The inquisitorial vaults, where the dismal texts are held, are built on the same layered defense principle as the Grey Knight's sanctum. Multiple checkpoints, armed gatekeepers, who maintain authority to deny entry even to inquisitors. Soul wards, arcane devices implanted in the bodies of the staff who work in the vaults, designed to trigger the destruction of their bearers if forbidden knowledge manages to latch onto their minds deeply enough to constitute a possession risk. The archivists who handle these texts directly are regularly mind-wiped, not once a day, as with the Grey Knight servitors, but on irregular schedules determined by supervisors monitoring for signs that the individuals are developing unusual patterns of thought. The operational philosophy of the dismal texts is frankly somewhat disturbing. The Inquisition has decided that these books must be kept rather than destroyed, on the grounds that the information they contain might be necessary for combating whatever they describe. But having decided to keep them, the Inquisition is then committed to a permanent campaign of damage control around the simple fact of their preservation. The books exist. They have content. That content is accessible to any mind that approaches closely enough. And every layer of guard and ward and mind-wiping protocol is essentially an attempt to ensure that the gap between approach and full comprehension can be managed. Would some inquisitors have died in the attempt to consult the dismal texts? Not because guards shot them, not because physical defenses killed them, because the act of reading a text describing the true nature of something terrible, combined with the psychic resonance still clinging to the pages, was enough to drive them past the boundary of what their minds could contain. This has led to an interesting and pragmatic distinction within the Inquisition's theological framework. It is officially stated in the codes that govern inquisitorial conduct that consulting the dismal texts is not, by itself, an act of heresy or evidence of corruption. The knowledge contained within them is sometimes simply necessary. What matters, the doctrine states, is what you do with that knowledge afterward, whether you use it to fight the enemies it describes, and or whether you find yourself being used by it. The problem, of course, is that by the time you have read enough of certain texts to know whether you are the one doing the using, the damage may already have been done. The best minds of the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Hereticus have spent centuries debating where exactly the line between sufficient knowledge and compromised knowledge lies. The answer they keep arriving at is not one that makes for comfortable reading. The line does not exist at a fixed point. It moves, depending on the specific individual, the specific text, the specific circumstances, and factors that cannot always be identified in advance. The only reliable protection is not to read the texts at all. And that protection is not always available to the people who are trying to do their jobs. Whilst there is a secondary body of knowledge within the Inquisition's archives that deserves mention here, which is the accumulated record of the traitor legions, the histories of the 9 Space Marine legions that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy. These are not demonic texts in the same sense as the dismal texts. They do not summon anything. They do not have the same kind of psychic resonance, but they are dangerous in a different and in some ways more immediately practical way. They contain tactical and strategic information about the capabilities of Chaos Space Marines that, if it were to reach the wrong hands, would provide considerable military advantage to the forces of the archenemy. They also contain, in their honest accounts, things that the Imperium would very much prefer not to have its citizens know, and accounts of what motivated the Legion's turn. Arguments that were made at the time in favour of joining Horus. Philosophical positions that, if read without sufficient critical distance, are not obviously incoherent. The Imperium's official history of the Horus heresy is the story of clear heroism against clear villainy. The Inquisition's actual records of that period tell a considerably more textured story, and that texture is its own kind of danger. There is another dimension to the Inquisition's relationship with forbidden knowledge that is worth exploring at length, and it concerns what happens to the Inquisitors themselves, not the dramatic failures, the ones who fall openly to heresy and are hunted down by their colleagues, the quieter changes, the gradual drift. An Inquisitor who devotes their career to the Ordo Malleus, as the demon hunters, is required by the nature of their work to spend decades, sometimes centuries, engaged with material that would destroy an ordinary mortal mind. They study demonic incursions. They read after-action reports from Grey Knight's engagements with greater demons. They consult the dismal texts when necessary. They interview survivors of possession events, who are often in states of trauma and partial psychological dissolution. They attend the interrogation of captured cultists, listening to the accounts of people who have willingly opened themselves to entities that the Inquisitor spends their entire career trying to stop. Over time, even for the most rigorously self-aware Inquisitor, something shifts. Not corruption, not in the formal theological sense, but a change in how the world feels. What the things they have learned about the nature of chaos make the ordinary world seem thinner somehow, less substantial. They know too well what is behind it, what is pressing against it from the other side, and knowing that has a weight that the most disciplined mind cannot entirely set aside. This is why the Inquisition has, built into its institutional culture, a tradition of inquisitors periodically requesting evaluation by their peers, not because they suspect themselves of corruption, because they know that the nature of their work makes the slow accumulation of weight inevitable, and that the only defense against that accumulation is regular, honest examination by minds that have not been tracking the same specific darkness, a second pair of eyes. At a perspective that has not been shaped by the same 10 or 20 or 50 years of studying the same aspect of the warp's reach into the material world. The Inquisitors who do not request these evaluations, who become convinced of their own invulnerability to the drift, are the ones who eventually become problems. The formal theological categories for this arc are Puritan and radical. A Puritan Inquisitor believes that any contact with heretical knowledge or Xenos technology or demonic power, however tactical the intention, is compromise that leads to corruption. A radical believes that the only way to fight the enemies of the Imperium is to understand and use what they use, to beat darkness with darkness. Neither position is entirely wrong. Both positions, taken to their extreme, which produce individuals whose usefulness to the Inquisition ends. The dismal texts sit at the heart of this tension. They exist because radical Inquisitors have repeatedly demonstrated that the information within them can be weaponized against the things they describe. They are restricted because Puritan Inquisitors have repeatedly demonstrated that access to them corrupts the individuals who study them too deeply. The compromise position, the one the Inquisition as an institution has arrived at after 10,000 years of practice, is controlled access for specific purposes with intensive monitoring and strict limits on the duration and depth of any single consultation. This compromise works more often than it fails, but it does sometimes fail, and when it fails, the Inquisition deals with the failure the way it deals with everything that becomes too dangerous to leave in the world, swiftly, quietly, and without record. Some of the most powerful individuals the Inquisition has ever produced have ended this way. Brilliant scholars who studied the dismal texts with genuine dedication to the purpose of fighting what they described, and who found, after years of that study, that the line between opposing something and embodying it had become unclear. Who found that their plans for fighting chaos had begun to incorporate methodologies that were themselves drawn from the very playbooks they had spent their careers studying, not because they were evil, not because they had been corrupted in any dramatic sense, but because the knowledge had shaped the knower, and as knowledge of powerful and specific things always does. You cannot study something for decades without beginning to think in its patterns, and the patterns of chaos, even opposed, are still the patterns of chaos. The dismal texts are kept because the Inquisition knows it cannot defeat what it does not understand. They are restricted because the Inquisition knows that the understanding, accumulated without sufficient protection and community and regular, honest self-examination, transforms the people doing the understanding in ways that are not always recoverable. This is the bargain at the heart of every forbidden library. You need the knowledge to survive. The knowledge, unmanaged, will change you. The management is therefore the entire game. Before the Adeptus Mechanicus was the Adeptus Mechanicus, before the Imperium existed at all, was before the Emperor emerged from Terra at the head of the armies that would begin the Great Crusade, there was a priest of Mars named Moravec. Moravec was a member of the Brotherhood of Singularitarianism, a faction within the early Mechanicum devoted to a specific and terrifying goal. They wanted to create artificial general intelligence, not the limited artificial intelligences that had been permitted and used in certain controlled applications throughout the dark age of technology, not the pattern-matching engines and calculation systems that did complex work without genuine thought, but a true machine mind. A consciousness born of metal and code rather than flesh and blood, capable of exceeding human intelligence, of accumulating knowledge at speeds no organic mind could match. It's of processing the full complexity of the universe and returning answers to questions that no human mind had the capacity to formulate. The creation of artificial general intelligence is one of the most profound prohibitions in all of imperial law. The men of iron, the self-aware machine intelligences that rose up against humanity at the end of the dark age of technology, are the reason for this prohibition. The catastrophe of their rebellion, the suffering and death they caused before they were finally suppressed, is one of the original traumas of human civilization in the 41st millennium's cosmology. The prohibition is not merely legal, it is theological. The omnissiah of the machine, God, did not intend for artificial minds to surpass their creators. To pursue that goal is not just heresy, it is considered, and by the deeper reaches of Mechanicus belief, to be a provocation of a force that is not entirely of the material universe. Moravec believed otherwise. His research was extensive, brilliant in its methods, and deeply dangerous in its implications. And the Emperor, who was paying close attention to Mars even in those early days, judged that the knowledge Moravec had accumulated was too dangerous to be destroyed, because its destruction might not eliminate the possibility of others arriving at the same place through different routes. So instead of burning it, the Emperor had it sealed, placed in a vault deep beneath Olympus Mons, in a hidden chamber nearly a kilometre underground within a maze of old tunnels, and locked with every lock that the combined ingenuity of the early Mechanicum could devise. These are the vaults of Moravec. So for thousands of years, those vaults stayed sealed. The knowledge inside them was considered so dangerous that the Emperor himself had placed the prohibition on them, and the successive fabricators general of Mars maintained the seals partly out of genuine fear and partly out of reverence for the divine authority that had originally locked them. Even the Mechanicum's extraordinary collective hunger for knowledge was, apparently, insufficient to overcome the weight of imperial decree. Then came Horus, the story of how War Master Horus Lupercal persuaded the Fabricator General of Mars, a being named Kelbor Hal, to betray the Emperor and join the rebellions, at its core, a story about the vaults of Moravec. Horus offered Kelbor Hal many things. He offered STC databases from worlds the Crusade had conquered. He offered autonomy from imperial oversight. He offered resources and influence and power. But the thing that sealed the bargain, the thing that Kelbor Hal could not resist, was the promise that the seals on the vaults of Moravec would be opened. Kelbor Hal opened the vaults, and in doing so, he sparked the schism of Mars, the civil war within the Mechanicum that ran parallel to the Horus heresy across the rest of the galaxy. The knowledge that poured out of the vaults was not immediately weaponized, not in the sense of being turned into machines or systems in the short term, but it was consumed, studied, integrated into the research programs of those Mechanicum factions that had sided with Horus. And from that consumption eventually emerged the Dark Mechanicum, though the chaos-aligned descendants of the Mechanicum who devote themselves to exactly the kind of research the Emperor had feared: demon engines, artificial intelligences fused with warp entities, technologies that blur the line between the material universe and the warp in ways that were never intended. The vaults of Moravec are, in retrospect, one of the clearest examples in the galaxy of the danger of forbidden knowledge in purely practical terms. The information they contained was not weaponized by being read, it was weaponized by being given to people who were already, through the choices they had made, in a position where chaos could influence how they used it. The knowledge was not evil in itself. The knowledge was available, and the beings who gained access to it were not prepared to handle it responsibly. But the story of the vaults of Moravec is also, in a strange and uncomfortable way, a story about why forbidden libraries exist in the first place. The Emperor did not destroy Moravec's research when he had the opportunity. He sealed it. He decided that the knowledge was worth preserving, even in the face of the obvious risk that sealing it, rather than destroying it, presented. He made a calculation. The calculation was that the potential value of Moravec's work, however dangerous its immediate applications, exceeded the cost of the risk of someone eventually opening the vault. Whether that calculation was correct is one of those questions that the 41st millennium does not offer clean answers to. The opening of the vaults contributed to the schism of Mars, just which contributed to the Horus Heresy's ability to proceed with such devastating effectiveness. The dark mechanicum that emerged from that opening has caused immeasurable suffering across 10,000 years. On the other hand, certain elements of Moravec's research base, the foundational understanding of machine cognition that his work represented, have been used by the loyal Adeptus Mechanicus in ways that have preserved technology and lives. The knowledge did not make only bad things, it made both kinds. This ambiguity runs through every forbidden library in the galaxy. They are not purely defensive institutions, places that simply contain things that must never be touched. They are also investment portfolios, collections of potential, and managed carefully against the day when the knowledge inside them might be exactly what a dire situation requires. The Adeptus Mechanicus' own restricted archives on Mars and across the Forge worlds reflect this investment philosophy more clearly than almost any other institution. The librarius omnis, that vast subterranean repository of knowledge buried in the labyrinthine catacombs beneath the red planet's rust-coloured surface, is not merely a vault of things too dangerous to release. It is also the Mechanicus' long-term research program. The prescribed technology files are not permanently prescribed. They are evaluated on a rolling basis, each generation of senior tech priests assessing whether the specific danger they represent has changed, whether new developments in warding and containment have reduced the risk of misuse, or whether the specific circumstances that originally made the prohibition necessary still exist. This is how the Adeptus Mechanicus thinks about forbidden knowledge in general. Not as absolute prohibition, but as conditional restriction. The condition being, is the current state of technology and institutional maturity sufficient to handle this safely? And the answer, for most of the proscribed technology files across most of the 10,000 years since the schism of Mars, has been no. The memory of what happened when those files were opened without sufficient preparation is too fresh, too vivid, too present in the institutional consciousness of an organization that maintains historical records with fanatical care. The librarius omnis itself is a place that rewards thinking about carefully. It is continent spanning, and it extends deep beneath the Martian surface, carved over millennia into the rock of the red planet, expanding as the Mechanicus accumulated more and more material over the millennia of the Imperium's existence. The actual physical scale of it is essentially incomprehensible. 100 generations of tech priests have worked and studied and added to it. Countless Margos have descended into its deeper levels in pursuit of specific pieces of knowledge, and some have not come back, not because of supernatural hazard, though there is some of that in the deepest sections where the most sensitive material is held, but simply because the place is too large, too complex, easy to lose yourself in, even with maps, even with guides, even with all the technological assistance that Mars can provide. Yes, there is a metaphor in this that the Adeptus Mechanicus does not discuss openly, but is not unaware of. The librarius omnis has grown so large that it exceeds any individual's capacity to know it completely. The institution that maintains it is, in a real sense, the collective custodian of knowledge that no individual within it fully possesses. The Fabricator General of Mars does not know everything in the librarius omnis. Nobody does. There are sections that have not been entered in generations, not because they are deliberately restricted, but because the institution has simply grown too large for consistent management. This is not a problem that the Mechanicus is entirely comfortable with. The principle of the quest for knowledge, their institutional driving purpose, implies a movement toward comprehensive understanding. But the practical reality of accumulation across millennia is that you can end up in a situation where the archive is so extensive that the knowledge of what the archive contains is itself a form of forbidden knowledge. To know completely what is in the librarius omnis would require a mind capable of comprehending more information than any human being, augmented or otherwise, can hold. The Fabricator General has access to more cogitative augmentation than any other being in the Imperium. It is still not enough. What the Mechanicus is slowly, quietly working toward, and this is something that exists in the very most restricted corners of their internal discussions, is the creation of a system that could manage the librarius omnis without any individual human mind needing to hold its full contents, a managing intelligence, which brings them, uncomfortably and inevitably, back to the very research that Moravec was doing when the Emperor sealed those vaults beneath Olympus Mons in the first place. The wheels of the 41st millennium turn slowly, but they do turn. The Adeptus Mechanicus of the 41st millennium keeps its own restricted archives on Mars and across its various forge worlds. The Librarius Omnis, the vast subterranean repository that spans the labyrinthine catacombs of the Red Planet, contains some of the most extensive technological records in the Imperium, including fragments of STC databases that have been under study for generations without yielding complete results. The truly dangerous material is considerably more carefully guarded, but the lessons of the schism of Mars are not forgotten by the descendants of the people who lived through them. There is, in the Mechanicus archives, a category of knowledge called proscribed technology. This designation covers things ranging from artificial intelligence to certain biological augmentations to specific types of energy weapons whose mechanisms involve warp interaction. The proscribed technology files are not accessible to ordinary tech priests. Access requires special dispensation from senior figures in the hierarchy, and the granting of that dispensation is accompanied by monitoring that is both intensive and covert. The tech priest who is granted temporary access to study a prescribed technology file does not always know exactly how closely their subsequent behavior will be watched. This is by design. But the Mechanicus's relationship with forbidden knowledge is in some ways the most honest in the Imperium. The cult Mechanicus does not dress up its restrictions in theological language about the Emperor's will, though it uses that language when convenient. Its internal justification for restricted knowledge is pragmatic. Certain information, in the hands of certain beings at certain moments, produces outcomes that are worse than the ignorance of those beings would have produced. The mechanism by which this happens is not always supernatural. Sometimes it is simply human. Sometimes it is just greed and ambition, and the willingness to cut corners and accept unacceptable risks when the potential reward looks sufficiently impressive. The Mechanicus has millennia of evidence that this is true, and so it builds its vaults deep, and it trains its guardians well, and it watches the people it trusts with careful and patient eyes. There is another archive, less well known than the Sanctum Sanctorum or the Black Library, that deserves its own discussion. It exists in fragments, distributed across the many watch fortresses of the Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos. To understand the Death Watch's archives, you first need to understand what the Death Watch is actually for. They are not simply elite alien hunters. The Death Watch is the Imperium's premier agency for the study, cataloguing, and when necessary, the elimination of Xenos threats. They are the institution that has accumulated more practical knowledge about alien species, their capabilities, their histories and their weaknesses than any other organization in the Imperium. The Ordo Xenos, for whom they serve as chamber militant, is the arm of the Inquisition dedicated to the threat of alien intelligence. And intelligent aliens in the 41st millennium are not merely military problems. They are, in many cases, repositories of knowledge and capability that predates human civilization by spans of time that make the entire history of the Imperium look like a brief afternoon. The Necrons, the ancient race of silicon-bodied warriors, sleeping in their tombs beneath the surfaces of 1,000 worlds, were once biological beings called the Necrontyr. They made a bargain with entities called the Citan, the star gods, beings of almost incomprehensible power, who fed on stellar energy and whose manipulation of matter and reality gave them something approaching divinity by the standards of any mortal civilization. As the Necrontyre transferred their consciousnesses into metal bodies, becoming the Necrons, and in doing so, they shed their biological vulnerabilities. But they also shed, eventually, large portions of what had made them individual, distinct, emotionally complex beings. The Citan consumed the Necrontyre's gods first, then turned on each other, then were shattered into shards by the newly immortal Necrons in a rebellion against their erstwhile patrons. This all happened before the Old Ones, the great progenitor civilization of the galaxy, were even at the peak of their power, before the Eldari existed as a species, before humanity had learned to use fire. The Deathwatch Vault archives contain records of what the Imperium knows about all of this, not the full story. Because the full story is not fully known, even by the most ancient and exhaustively researched institutions, but fragments, pieces, records from encounters with Necron dynasties, from the study of Necron artifacts, from the rare and fragile moments when communication between Imperial forces and Necron nobles has been achieved in some fashion, records that describe, in whatever accuracy the surviving observers could manage, what the Necrons are and what they want. And the Citan shards, the shattered remnants of entities that were once divine by any useful definition of the word, each fragment still carrying incomprehensible power, now contained in the Tesseract prison cages that the Necrons themselves developed to imprison them after the rebellion. The Deathwatch has encountered Citan shards in the field, has fought them, has, as in at least some cases, obtained them and brought them back to Vault archives for study. The knowledge of what a Citan shard actually is, held within a mind that is not psychically shielded and institutionally prepared for the implications, would not produce useful tactical knowledge. It would produce something closer to a crisis of cosmic proportion. The Citan are beings for whom the normal categories of living and not living do not apply, for whom time functions differently than it does for mortal minds, who exist in a state of relationship to the material universe that makes the Chaos Gods seem almost comprehensible by comparison. A mind that genuinely understood what it was encountering in a Citan shard, understood it completely and accurately, Umisha would have to simultaneously hold two things that are extraordinarily difficult to hold together. The recognition that this thing is vastly more powerful and ancient than anything in normal human experience, and the operational understanding that it must be treated as a threat to be contained and managed. The first recognition tends, in unprepared minds, to preclude the second. This is why the Deathwatch librarians are the gatekeepers of the Vault archives. They carry the aegis, the psychic armor that every Grey Knight also bears in their own form, a shield of concentrated mental discipline that creates a buffer between the librarian's consciousness and the psychic weight of what they are accessing. Without that buffer, the whispers that the librarian hears upon entering the archive would not be merely whispers. They would be an immediate and overwhelming experience of being simultaneously in the presence of multiple intelligences that are each, individually, older than human civilization. There is one watch fortress whose Vault archive deserves particular mention for the specific nature of its contents. The Watch Fortress Erioch, located in the Jericho Reach, houses at its heart a structure called the Omega Vault. The Omega Vault is different from the standard Vault archives in a specific and disturbing way. It is sealed absolutely. Even the Deathwatch does not have unrestricted access to the Omega Vault. It opens on its own schedule, by mechanisms that nobody fully understands. And when it opens, it does not always release the same kind of contents. Sometimes it offers weapons, sometimes information, as sometimes objects of uncertain purpose that require years of study before their function is understood. The Omega Vault operates as though it has its own agenda, as though it is not merely a storage facility, but something closer to a guide, releasing what it contains in response to circumstances rather than requests. The Deathwatch uses what it receives and does not ask too many questions about the mechanism behind the offering, which is itself an interesting philosophical position for an organization devoted to investigation and study. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is to look too closely at the hand that is helping you. The accumulated Xenos lore of the Death Watch, across all its watch fortresses and all its centuries of operation, represents a kind of knowledge that is categorically different from the chaos-focused archives of the Grey Knights and the Inquisition. The threat of chaos is specific in certain ways. It works through the warp. It exploits psychic sensitivity. It targets emotion and desire. Its methods, while infinitely varied in application, have certain recognizable patterns. A scholar who has spent decades studying chaos has learned to recognize those patterns and has developed, through that recognition, some degree of resistance to them. The Xenos threat does not operate through predictable patterns. Every alien civilization is genuinely alien. Their motivations do not map onto human categories. Whilst their understanding of time and consciousness and purpose are sometimes incompatible with mortal comprehension, in ways that are not about psychic corruption, but simply about the radical difference in what it means to be a Necron or a Cetan shard, versus what it means to be a human. The danger of the Death Watch's archives is not that they will corrupt the reader toward chaos. It is that they will dissolve the reader's understanding of what the universe is, replacing it with a perspective so vast and so inhuman that the practical business of being a mortal creature in a mortal body with a mortal life becomes essentially incoherent. This is its own kind of danger, not dramatic, not violent, but just as total. The Death Watch librarians who guard those archives are, in some sense, the most isolated scholars in the Imperium. What the Grey Knights have their brotherhood, their shared understanding of what they carry. The Inquisition has its collegial structure, the shared frameworks of the Orders. But the Death Watch librarians, who know things about the Necrons and the Titan and the Old Ones and the epochs before the current shape of the galaxy was even settled, carry a kind of knowledge that has very few frames of reference. They cannot discuss it widely. They cannot compare notes with colleagues outside their extremely restricted circle. They hold it alone, each of them, in the dark of the archive corridors, and they manage it the way you manage anything very heavy. One step at a time, careful balance, never letting yourself believe the weight is gone. At the heart of each watch fortress, there is a structure called the Vault. And the Vault contains two types of things. The first is weapons and technology, alien devices recovered from the field and brought back for study, objects that might be useful against the species that made them. The second is knowledge. The archive section of each vault is the exclusive domain of the Death Watch librarians who serve that fortress. The watch commander, however senior or experienced, does not have access to the archive. The watch commander is not trusted to read it. This is not a matter of rank. It is a matter of what the archive contains. Specifically, the Vault archives contain the accumulated record of every Xenos entity that Death Watch forces have encountered, with particular emphasis on the most ancient and the most powerful. This includes, but is not limited to, information gathered from studies of the Necrons, and the silicon-bodied undying warriors of the ancient Necrontire civilization and their Cetan masters, the so-called star gods who were among the first entities to achieve something like divinity within the material universe. It includes records from encounters with Old Ones, or the remnants and creations of the Old Ones. It includes fragmentary information about civilizations so ancient that their names have not survived even in Aeldari records. The Death Watch librarian, who must enter the Vault archive to consult its contents, does not do so casually. The text is explicit about this. It is only in the direst of circumstances that a librarian will enter, because each time he does, he is exposed to the whispering voices of long-dead alien beings, is tempting him with the power to rule the whole of humanity in the name of ancient and blasphemous gods. Let that sentence sit for a moment. These are not living entities. They are records, texts, data, but the information they contain is so charged with the psychic weight of what it describes, the records of beings so powerful and so alien that their thoughts left permanent impressions in the fabric of the material universe, that even the collected records of their histories carry something of their nature. A Death Watch librarian, entering the archive, hears voices, suggestions, offers. This is the defining characteristic of the most dangerous forbidden libraries in the 41st millennium. The knowledge has agency, not in the same way that a living being has agency, not with planning and intention and the ability to respond to changing circumstances, but in the way that a resonance has energy. A struck bell does not intend to vibrate, but it vibrates anyway, and the vibration is real, and the sound reaches the ears of anyone close enough to hear it. The whispers in the Death Watch Vault archives are the resonance of civilizations so ancient and so powerful that their ideas still vibrate in the psychic fabric of the universe, even after their physical forms are dust. Every librarian who enters that archive is walking into a space where those ideas are concentrated, where the accumulated weight of alien thought is pressing outward against the walls of its containment, testing for minds that might be receptive. The tech in the room, the shielding, the psychic dampeners, the physical defenses, are all there to reduce the amplitude of that pressure to manageable levels. But reduce is not eliminate. And so the librarian who enters is always walking a line between the information he needs to do his job and the information that would, if it crossed far enough into his consciousness, begin to do its own job on him. By this point, a pattern should be visible across all of these different libraries and archives. Behind all of their varying physical and psychic defenses, there is a single fundamental truth that ties them together. It is not complicated, but it is profound. In the 41st millennium, the most dangerous thing in the universe is not a weapon, it is not an army, it is not a chaos god or a demon or a primarch corrupted by 10,000 years of service to the ruinous powers. I see the most dangerous thing in the universe is accurate understanding of how the universe actually works. Not superstition, not propaganda, not the sanitized and carefully managed version of reality that the Imperium feeds its billions of subjects so that they can live functional lives without being overwhelmed by the enormity of the threats surrounding them. Genuine understanding. The kind you get from reading the Black Library's complete record of Chaos's nature, or the Grey Knight's accumulated catalogue of demonic names, or the Death Watch's archive of things so old that the universe was different when they were alive. The reason this understanding is dangerous is not that it empowers the wrong people, though it does that. It is not that it could be misused, though it absolutely could be. Or it is that the universe of Warhammer 40,000 is a place where the boundary between knowing something and being affected by what you know is much thinner than any comfortable philosophy of knowledge would suggest. In our world, we generally assume that knowledge is inert until it is acted upon. You can know a terrible thing without becoming a terrible thing. You can understand evil without being corrupted by it. The knowing and the being are separate. In the 41st millennium, that separation is not reliable because the things these archives contain information about are not merely historical or physical phenomena. They are psychic phenomena. They exist in the warp as well as the material universe. They have, in a real sense, awareness, not the kind of awareness that sits down and reads documents, but the kind that responds to attention, that is strengthened by being thought about, that can follow the threads of awareness back to their source. The Chaos Gods grow stronger when they are worshipped. They grow stronger when they are feared. They grow stronger when they are understood, if that understanding is not protected by sufficient spiritual preparation. Every time a mortal mind grasps, with genuine accuracy, the nature of Sanctum, or Horn, or Nurgle, or Slanesh, every time that understanding reaches a certain depth and clarity, there is a corresponding movement in the warp. A faint vibration, a subtle increase in connectivity, a tiny new thread in the web that connects the material universe to the realm of those entities. The forbidden libraries are, in this sense, extraordinarily concentrated repositories of that connectivity. The Black Library contains 10,000 years of accurate Eldari understanding of chaos. The Librarium Demonica contains 10,000 years of Grey Knight's understanding of specific demonic entities. The dismal texts contain the most detailed human records of warp phenomena ever assembled. All of that understanding, all of that accurate comprehension lives in those places. And the things being understood can, faintly but genuinely, feel its presence. They press toward it. They look for minds that might open to them through the keyhole of what those minds already know. Think about what that means for the scale of the protection required. It is not enough to guard against individual intrusion. The library itself is a target, not just in the sense of a place that enemies might want to raid, or in the sense of a place that the warp itself is always, in its blind and diffuse way, pressing against. The accumulated understanding of chaos's nature that lives in the Black Library is felt by chaos, not specifically, not with individual awareness, but as a resonance, a pull, an attractor in the psychic landscape of the galaxy that shapes the currents of the warp around it in ways that the Eldari have had 10,000 years to study and learn to manage. The Grey Knight's fortress on Titan is a location of such concentrated demon knowledge that the psychic null space around it is measurably different from the null space around any other similar body. Something lives in that difference. Not a demon, not an entity with will and intention, but a shape, the shape of 10,000 years of very specific and very careful understanding. You're pressed up against the barrier that separates knowing it from being consumed by it. This is why the defenses around these archives are not designed to keep people out of rooms. They are designed to maintain a barrier between two states of awareness, the state of not knowing and the state of knowing, and to ensure that only beings sufficiently prepared to exist in the state of knowing, without being broken by it or used by it, ever cross that threshold. This is also why the consequences for failed entry are so absolute. The psychic vortex in the Librarium Demonica does not injure intruders. It destroys their souls. Not because the Grey Knights are sadistic, but because a person who crosses into the knowing space of that archive without preparation is, in the judgment of the beings who built those defenses, likely to become a conduit, a vector, something through which the things described in those texts can reach a little further into the world. Better, in that calculus, for there to be no soul at all than for that soul to carry the wrong information to the wrong places. There is a philosophical tradition within certain very restricted corners of the Inquisition that has spent centuries wrestling with the implications of this reality. The tradition is sometimes called the School of Epistemic Danger, though that name is used internally and never in official documentation. Its central insight is this: in the 41st millennium, ignorance has a protective function that it does not have in safer environments. Not because ignorance is good, but because the cost of knowing in a universe where knowing creates psychic connection, there is a cost that must always be weighed against the benefit. Every mind that genuinely understands a chaos entity is also, in a small and technical sense, a bridge between that entity and the material world. Every scholar who has read and truly comprehended the dismal texts is also, in the same small and technical sense, slightly more accessible to the things described in those texts than a person who has never read them. The implication, which the School of Epistemic Danger develops with uncomfortable rigor, is that the ideal state for most people is not comprehensive, accurate understanding of the universe's dangers. It is sufficient understanding to function safely and to fight effectively, no more. The comprehensive understanding should be concentrated in as few minds as possible, minds that have been specifically prepared for it, and those minds should be maintained and monitored with the kind of care that weapons of mass destruction receive, which is, when you think about it, exactly what the Forbidden Libraries do. This is the 41st millennium, where the cost of curiosity is frequently death, where the line between scholarship and heresy is drawn not by the content of what you know, but by your spiritual capacity to hold that knowledge without being consumed by it, where the most important gatekeepers in the galaxy are not soldiers, but sages, and where the criteria for admission to the most significant places in existence are entirely invisible to the uninformed and entirely evident to those who know what to look for. Nobody enters the Forbidden Libraries because the Forbidden Libraries know who you are before you do. They know what you carry inside you. What fears and desires and ambitions are still raw enough to be exploited? What corners of your soul have not yet been examined and confronted? What the darkness within you still looks like from the outside? How much room it has? Whether it is the kind that will be satisfied or the kind that will be fed. And they make their judgments accordingly. The irony, which the universe of the 41st millennium serves up with characteristically grim consistency, is that the beings best equipped to read and survive the contents of these archives are not the scholars or the warriors or the powerful. They are the ones who have already survived their worst moments. The ones who have looked directly at the darkest things they carry and come through the looking without flinching. To the solitaires who have embodied the destruction of their own civilization and kept dancing. The Illuminati who were possessed by demons and expelled them and stood back up. The Grey Knights who train from the moment of their creation to carry the warp's darkness within them as a weapon rather than a wound. Not ignorance, not power, not cleverness or piety or rank. The willingness to know yourself completely in all your worst potential and to have made peace with it. That is the admission price to the most dangerous libraries in existence, and almost nobody can pay it. There is one last thing worth saying about forbidden libraries in the 41st millennium, and it is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. The collections keep growing. Every battle the Grey Knights fight adds to the Librarium Demonica. Every new demon encountered is catalogued, its name and nature and weaknesses added to those age-worn oak cabinets. Every inquisitorial investigation that surfaces a previously unknown heretical text adds another volume to the dismal texts. Every Deathwatch mission that penetrates deeper into a Xenos civilization's secrets returns with material for the Vault archives. The Black Library actively seeks out new knowledge of chaos from any species capable of generating it, integrating that knowledge into its own collections. These repositories of dangerous knowledge are not static. They expand. The universe keeps producing new horrors, new corruptions, new entities that have never been named or categorized before, and the institutions that guard against those horrors keep recording them. Is preserving the hard-won understanding of what they encountered, locking it away in places that almost no one can reach. The galaxy is, in this sense, getting more dangerous to know accurately as time goes on. After the formation of the Great Rift, the massive tear in reality that now divides the Imperium into two isolated halves, the challenge facing these archives became even more acute. The Great Rift is not merely a physical barrier. It is a permanent and enormous scar in the barrier between the warp and the material universe, a wound in reality that has allowed chaos energies to bleed more freely into the material world than at any point in living memory. The psychic weight pressing against every archive in the galaxy increased dramatically the moment the rift opened. The sanctum sanctorum on Titan sits closer, in psychic terms, up to the things it describes than it did a generation ago. The Inquisition's vaults have required emergency rewarding as texts that had been stable for centuries began to exhibit new behaviours. The Black Library itself has, according to certain fragmentary accounts, altered its course through the webway in response to the changed landscape of the labyrinth dimension. The rift changed everything, not by introducing new kinds of danger, but by intensifying the ones that already existed. The line between the archives of forbidden knowledge and the things those archives describe has never been thinner. The defenses have never been more important. And the beings who maintain them have never been more aware of how much depends on the discipline and the preparation and the honest self-knowledge that keeps each one of them on the right side of the doors they guard. Every new demon named in the Librarium Demonica is one that the Grey Knights can fight more effectively, but it is also one more entity whose true nature exists somewhere in the universe in recorded form, waiting for the moment when a mind that is not prepared for it comes too close. Every new volume added to the Black Library is another piece of the Eldari's understanding of what destroyed them, preserved against the eventual day when someone will need to use that understanding to prevent the next destruction. But it is also another weight on the scales that the library's psychic consciousness is constantly maintaining, as the balance between containing the knowledge and being contained by it. Every new text added to the Inquisition's restricted archives is another record of evil that exists, so the evil can eventually be defeated. And another text whose mere existence, if it were ever exposed to the wrong minds, could become the seed of the very evil it describes. This is the deepest truth of forbidden knowledge in the 41st millennium. The libraries do not simply preserve danger, they are themselves a form of danger, concentrated, maintained, grown over millennia into collections of such psychic weight that the very fact of their existence changes the shape of the universe around them. The Black Library bends the webway. The sanctum sanctorum's influence can be felt in the psychic null space around Titan. Should the Inquisition's archives leave marks on the minds of everyone who has ever worked in them, marks that can, under the right circumstances, be read by things that should not be able to read anything. The forbidden libraries are not just places where dangerous things are kept. They are themselves among the most dangerous places in existence, which is why nobody enters them lightly. Why the guards at their doors are among the most capable and most trusted beings in their respective civilizations. Why the criteria for entry are so stringent that most of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy could not meet them. And why, when someone does occasionally manage to get inside, the whole galaxy tends to feel it. This has been a journey through the most guarded vaults of knowledge in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So from the Black Library drifting through the dark passages of the webway, to the adamantium-walled Librarium Demonica on the frozen moon of Titan, to the Inquisition's dismal texts, and the ancient vaults of Moravec on Mars. From Ahriman's 10,000-year vigil at a door that will not open for him, to the rare and remarkable moment when the Black Council invited Bronislaw Chevac inside, and watched what he did with that invitation. It is worth, at the end of all of this, returning to the question we started with, and sitting with it differently than we could at the beginning. Why does nobody enter the forbidden libraries? The simple answer, the one you can give before you understand the details, is because it is dangerous, because they are guarded, because the contents could corrupt or destroy an unprepared mind. The answer you arrive at after understanding the details is more interesting. Nobody enters the forbidden libraries because the libraries themselves are part of a living system, a network of carefully maintained equilibria between the knowledge that mortal beings need to survive the darkness and the darkness that knowledge of the darkness creates. Every time those equilibria hold, every time the defenses remain intact, and the archives remain accessible to the right beings for the right purposes, the galaxy is slightly better positioned to endure what is always pressing against it. Every time an equilibrium fails, every time someone gets in who should not, or every time the knowledge escapes in forms that cannot be managed, and the galaxy moves slightly closer to outcomes that the universe of the 41st millennium has a very extensive vocabulary for describing and an extremely limited toolkit for preventing. The forbidden libraries are not decoration. They are not merely institutions. They are active participants in the long war that defines the 41st millennium. The Black Library's psychic barrier is as much a weapon against chaos as any Harlequin's blade. The Librarium Demonica's accumulated names are as much a weapon against demons as any Grey Knight's sword. The Inquisition's controlled access to the dismal texts is as much a weapon against heresy as any Ordo Hereticus investigation. And the price of maintaining these weapons is the perpetual discipline of the beings who hold them. But not just the external discipline of ritual and structure and procedure, though those matter enormously. The internal discipline, the daily, ongoing act of knowing the darkness and choosing not to become it. The commitment that has to be remade. Consciously, every single time a scholar enters those archives, and every single time they leave. This is why the stories of the people who have entered forbidden libraries and survived are so compelling. Chevac, rejuvenated by the webway's healing energies, coming out with the Atlas Infernal and spending decades using what he learned to fight the things the library described. The Grey Knights librarians standing their daily vigil before the Librarium Demonica's doors, choosing the same thing every morning that they chose on the first day of their service. The White Seers of the Black Library are cataloguing knowledge that would shatter most minds, sustained by whatever passes for peace in a being who has accepted that they will spend their lives this close to the things that destroyed their civilization. These beings are not heroes in the conventional sense. They do not carry banners or lead charges or earn the songs that warriors sing after victories. They do most of their work in the dark, in silence, in the particular kind of isolation that comes from knowing things that almost nobody else knows. They are the custodians of the most important resource in the galaxy, which is not the knowledge itself, but the ability to hold it safely. In a universe defined by war and darkness and the grinding, perpetual weight of survival against odds that should make survival impossible, that custodianship is its own form of courage. Was the Forbidden Libraries stand, and in their standing they represent something that the 41st Millennium does not easily produce. Deliberate, careful, patient resistance. Not to an army, not to a demon, but to the slow erosion that begins the moment you stop paying attention to what the knowledge you carry is doing to you. They stand because the beings inside them have decided over and over and over again that the standing is worth the cost. What ties all of it together is not the dramatic language of protection or the institutional weight of restrictions. What ties it together is a genuine and deeply thought-through philosophy of knowledge, one that recognizes something most comfortable philosophies prefer to ignore. Knowledge is not free, not in this universe. It comes with a cost, and the cost is proportional to the depth and accuracy of what you have understood. The more completely and honestly you understand the nature of chaos, of demons, of the ancient alien things that predate civilization, the closer you are to those things, and the closer you are to them, the more they can reach you. The Forbidden Libraries of the 41st Millennium are monuments to that philosophy, built by beings who decided that the only thing worse than knowing was not knowing, but who also understood, with painful clarity, that the knowing had to be protected, maintained, given only to those who could carry it without being carried away by it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, knowledge is ammunition. And like all ammunition, it must be stored carefully, carried responsibly, and used only by those who have been trained to fire it in the right direction. If you have stayed with this exploration all the way through, if you have found the quiet hours of thinking about the darkest corners of the 41st Millennium worthwhile, then please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to Q on 40,000. This kind of deep dive atmospheric lore content is exactly what this channel is built for. There is so much of the 41st Millennium that exists in shadow that the codexes and the battle reports and the model releases do not quite reach, and exploring that shadow is some of the most rewarding work in the hobby. The library, as always, is waiting, and the door, as always, is deciding whether you are ready to walk through it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.